My name is Miranda Cole, I'm 26 years old, and I'm standing in the Forbes magazine office after my photo shoot for their 30 Under 30 feature when my phone buzzes with a text that makes my blood freeze. The message is from Mom, and it's the first time she's contacted me in 8 years. Saw you in Forbes, honey. We should talk. I never stopped loving you. My hands start shaking as I stare at those words, because the last thing my mother said to me was that I was dead to her family. Before we dive into the story of betrayal, abandonment, and the sweetest revenge success can bring, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you've ever felt rejected by the people who were supposed to support you. And don't forget to subscribe because this journey from rock bottom to Forbes recognition will show you that sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming everything they said you'd never be. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. 8 years ago, I was 18 years old and completely on fire with passion for computer programming and entrepreneurship. While my classmates were planning their college majors around safe, traditional careers, I was staying up until 3 in the morning teaching myself coding languages and dreaming about building the next revolutionary tech company. I lived in a small working-class town in Ohio with my parents, Janet and Robert Cole, who had spent their entire lives working factory jobs and believing that stability meant everything. They weren't bad people, but they had a very narrow view of what success looked like, especially for women. My mother, Janet, worked as a cashier at the local grocery store for 15 years, and my father, Robert, spent his days on the assembly line at the automotive plant. They had dreams for me, but those dreams involved me becoming a nurse or an elementary school teacher because those were stable women's jobs that would guarantee me a steady paycheck and health insurance. Every time I tried to talk to them about technology or business ideas, I could see their eyes glaze over with a mixture of confusion and concern. They thought I was living in a fantasy world, chasing something that wasn't meant for people like us. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a cold February evening during my second semester of community college. I had been majoring in general studies while secretly building my programming skills and working on a business plan for a social networking platform specifically designed for small businesses. I knew my parents expected me to declare nursing as my major, but I had made a decision that would alter the course of my life forever. I walked into our cramped living room where they were watching television and announced that I was dropping out of community college to start my own technology company. The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. My father muted the television and turned to stare at me like I had just told them I was planning to join a cult. My mother's face went through a series of expressions, starting with confusion, moving to disbelief, and finally settling on pure anger. "You're throwing your life away for computer nonsense," my father said, his voice rising with each word. "We didn't sacrifice everything to give you opportunities just so you could waste them on some pipe dream." What happened next was the most painful conversation of my young life. My mother stood up and pointed her finger at me with a rage I had never seen before. "No daughter of mine will embarrass this family by becoming some kind of computer geek dropout," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "You think you're smarter than everyone else, but you're just a naive little girl who doesn't understand how the real world works." They gave me an ultimatum that would haunt me for years to come. Choose your fantasy or choose your family. I tried to explain my business plan, to show them the research I had done and the potential I saw in the technology market, but they refused to listen. They saw my passion as rebellion and my ambition as selfishness. The argument escalated until my father told me that if I was determined to throw my life away, I could do it somewhere else. My mother's final words to me that night were the ones that cut deepest. "You're not my daughter anymore." My daughter would never be this stupid and ungrateful. I made the defiant decision to leave home that very night, packing everything I could fit into a single backpack and walking out the front door with tears streaming down my face. I had saved up $3,000 from my part-time job at a local restaurant, my beat-up Honda Civic, and an unshakable belief that I could prove them wrong. What I didn't know was that my parents would change the locks the next day, block my phone number, and tell our extended family that I was dead to them. When my Aunt Carol asked about me a few months later, my mother told her they no longer had a daughter named Miranda. That first night, I slept in my car in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, using my jacket as a blanket and wondering if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. The reality of being completely alone at 18 years old hit me like a freight train, but I was too proud and too stubborn to go crawling back home. I had made my choice, and I was going to live with the consequences, no matter how terrifying they seemed in that cold, dark parking lot. The first 2 years after leaving home were a masterclass in survival and resilience that I wouldn't wish on anyone, but that ultimately shaped me into the person I am today. I bounced between couch surfing with acquaintances from community college and spending nights in my car when those temporary arrangements inevitably fell through. During the day, I worked whatever minimum wage jobs I could find, from waiting tables at diners to stocking shelves at retail stores, all while teaching myself advanced programming languages during every spare moment I could steal. My routine was exhausting but purposeful. I would work 8-hour shifts on my feet, grab a quick dinner from whatever dollar menu I could afford, then drive to the public library where I would code until they kicked me out at closing time. The librarians eventually got used to seeing me hunched over the computers every single night, my notebook filled with sketches for user interfaces and business models. I was building something, even though I wasn't entirely sure what it would become. Everything changed when I met Derek Watson during my second year of struggle. Derek was a 22-year-old business student at the State University who exuded the kind of confidence and charisma that made people believe he was destined for success. He was tall, well-dressed, and spoke with the polished vocabulary of someone who had grown up around money and opportunity. When he struck up a conversation with me at a coffee shop where I was working on my laptop, I was immediately drawn to his enthusiasm and apparent business acumen. Derek claimed he had been looking for a technical partner to help him launch a revolutionary social networking platform, and when he saw my code samples, he insisted that I was exactly the programmer he needed. He painted a picture of us as the perfect team, his business expertise combined with my technical skills. More than that, he seemed to genuinely believe in my abilities at a time when I desperately needed someone to validate my decision to leave everything behind. Within weeks, our professional relationship had evolved into a romantic one, and I found myself falling hard for someone who seemed to understand my ambitions. We spent months working together on ConnectU, a social platform designed to help small businesses network with each other and share resources. Derek handled the business plan and investor presentations while I built the entire technical infrastructure from scratch. I worked 18-hour days perfecting the user experience, creating algorithms for matching compatible businesses, and debugging code until my eyes burned from staring at screens. Derek would bring me coffee and sandwiches during my marathon coding sessions, telling me how brilliant I was and how we were going to change the world together. The platform we created was genuinely innovative for its time, incorporating features that wouldn't become mainstream for several more years. I had poured my heart, soul, and every ounce of technical knowledge into building something that could actually compete with established players in the market. When we finished the beta version, Derek arranged meetings with potential investors and talked about launching officially within the next 6 months. That's when Derek betrayed me in a way that made my parents' rejection feel like a gentle disappointment by comparison. I discovered his betrayal completely by accident when I was checking our shared business email account and found messages between Derek and a group of investors that made my blood run cold. Derek had been positioning himself as the sole founder and technical genius behind ConnectU, describing me as nothing more than a coding contractor who had helped with some of the basic programming work. The worst part wasn't just that he was stealing credit for my work, but that he had been secretly rewriting the company's incorporation documents to remove me as a co-founder and reduce my equity to less than 5%. When I confronted him about these emails, Derek dropped his charming facade and revealed a calculating coldness that I had never seen before. He told me that I was naive if I thought a college dropout waitress could be taken seriously in the business world, and that he was actually doing me a favor by giving me any equity at all. Derek launched ConnectU without me just 2 weeks later, using my code and technical architecture while publicly claiming that he had developed the entire platform himself. When I tried to take legal action to protect my intellectual property, I quickly discovered that I couldn't afford the kind of lawyers who could take on a case against someone with Derek's family connections and financial resources. He had structured everything carefully to make it nearly impossible for me to prove my contributions, and his legal team sent me cease and desist letters threatening to sue me for defamation if I continued claiming credit for work that clearly belonged to Mr. Watson. The betrayal destroyed me financially and emotionally. Derek had convinced several of my former contacts in the tech community that I was an unstable ex-girlfriend who was trying to sabotage his business out of spite. Potential employers in the technology field began treating me with suspicion, and I found myself blacklisted from opportunities one had been pursuing for months. The platform I had built went on to attract significant investment and media attention, but my name was nowhere to be found in any of the coverage. I spent the next 6 months sleeping in my car more nights than not, showering at a cheap gym membership that cost me $20 a month, and surviving on ramen noodles and whatever free food I could find. There were nights when I sat in parking lots staring at my parents' phone number, my finger hovering over the call button, wondering if my pride was worth this level of suffering. But every time I came close to calling them, I remembered the contempt in my mother's voice when she said I wasn't her daughter anymore, and I put the phone away. The experience with Derek taught me that betrayal could come from the people closest to you, wrapped in declarations of love and partnership. It was a lesson that would shape every relationship and business decision I made for years to come, but at the time, it felt like confirmation that maybe my parents had been right about me all along. Years 3 and 4 of my journey brought the first glimmer of hope that maybe I wasn't destined to fail after all, but they also delivered another devastating lesson about trust that nearly broke my spirit entirely. I had clawed my way back from the disaster with Derek by taking a job as a junior developer at a small marketing firm, where my boss noticed my ability to create solutions that other programmers couldn't figure out. The work was mundane and the pay was barely enough to afford a tiny studio apartment, but it gave me the stability I needed to start building something new. During this time, I met Sophie Brennan at a Women in Technology networking event that I almost didn't attend because I couldn't afford the registration fee. Sophie was everything I aspired to be, a 40-something entrepreneur who had built and sold 2 successful companies, a confident speaker who commanded respect in rooms full of skeptical investors, and someone who seemed genuinely interested in helping other women break through barriers in the tech industry. When she approached me after my presentation about blockchain applications for small business verification, I felt like I was meeting a fairy godmother. Sophie took me under her wing in a way that felt almost too good to be true. She invited me to coffee meetings where she shared war stories from her entrepreneurial journey, introduced me to investors and potential partners, and offered guidance on everything from product development to market positioning. When I showed her my prototype for TaskFlow, a productivity application designed to help small businesses manage their workflows more efficiently, Sophie's enthusiasm was infectious. She saw the same potential I did and offered to help me turn it into a real company. TaskFlow was built on everything I had learned from the disaster with Derek, but with better security features and a more intuitive user interface that reflected years of additional programming experience. The application could integrate with existing business systems and use artificial intelligence to suggest workflow optimizations, potentially saving small business owners hours of administrative work each week. Sophie helped me refine the business model and connected me with early adopters who provided valuable feedback during the development process. Under Sophie's mentorship, TaskFlow began experiencing steady growth that felt sustainable and real. We attracted our first 100 paying customers within 6 months, then 500 within a year. Sophie helped me navigate the legal complexities of intellectual property protection and business incorporation, ensuring that I maintained full control over my technology while building a legitimate company structure. For the first time since leaving home, I felt like I was building something that could actually change my life. I made the mistake of trusting Sophie completely, sharing not just my business plans, but also my personal story about being disowned by my family and betrayed by Derek. Sophie listened with apparent sympathy and understanding, positioning herself as the supportive mentor figure I had been missing. She encouraged me to think bigger and bolder, talking about expansion opportunities and the potential for TaskFlow to become a major player in the business productivity market. Sophie's support gave me the confidence to finally move out of my cramped studio apartment and into a decent one-bedroom place, to buy clothes that weren't from thrift stores, and to start believing that maybe I could actually build the successful company I had dreamed about as a teenager. I was working 16-hour days developing new features and managing customer relationships, but it felt sustainable because I had a partner who understood the business side of things. That's when Sophie revealed her true intentions in the most devastating way possible. I discovered her betrayal when I walked into her office unexpectedly to discuss a potential partnership opportunity and overheard her on a phone call with executives from a major software company. Sophie was deep in negotiations to sell TaskFlow to them, discussing my technology and customer base as if they were assets she owned rather than the result of my years of work and sacrifice. The conversation I overheard made it clear that Sophie had been planning this betrayal for months, positioning herself as the business mastermind behind TaskFlow while minimizing my role to that of a talented but inexperienced programmer who needed adult supervision. She was negotiating a deal that would net her millions of dollars while leaving me with a small payout and no control over the company I had built. When she noticed me standing in her doorway, Sophie had the audacity to smile and tell the person on the phone that she would call them back. Sophie's justification for her betrayal was even more infuriating than Derek's had been because it was wrapped in condescending concern for my well-being. She told me that I was too emotional and too inexperienced to handle the pressures of running a major company, and that selling to an established player was actually in my best interest. She claimed that I should be grateful for her guidance and the financial return she had negotiated, as if stealing my company was some kind of favor she was doing for me. The battle that followed was brutal and expensive, draining my energy and resources while Sophie used her connections and experience to turn other investors against me. She painted me as an unstable young woman who was incapable of seeing the bigger picture, someone who was letting her emotions cloud her business judgment. Several potential partners and investors began questioning my leadership abilities, and I found myself fighting not just for control of my company, but for my professional reputation. I managed to retain control of TaskFlow, but only by buying out Sophie's stake at a price that left me financially vulnerable and deeply in debt. The experience taught me that betrayal could come from someone who positioned themselves as a mentor and protector, someone who claimed to understand your struggles while secretly planning to profit from them. Sophie's parting words to me were that I would never survive in the business world because I was too trusting and too naive, and that she had actually been trying to save me from my own inevitable failure. The aftermath of Sophie's betrayal left me cynical and suspicious in ways that would affect every relationship I built going forward. I had learned that even people who seemed genuinely supportive could be calculating predators waiting for the right moment to strike. But I had also learned that I was stronger and more resourceful than I had ever imagined, capable of fighting for what I had built even when the odds seemed impossible. Years 4 and 5 brought TaskFlow to new heights of success, but they also introduced me to a level of corporate manipulation and psychological warfare that made my previous betrayals look like amateur hour. After successfully buying out Sophie and rebranding the company as StreamlineWorks, I had built something genuinely impressive, a productivity platform serving over 5,000 small businesses across 12 states, with revenue growing by 30% every quarter. My success was attracting attention from major players in the technology industry, which should have felt like validation, but instead filled me with a dread I couldn't quite explain. Harrison Blackwell was the kind of tech mogul who appeared on magazine covers and gave keynote speeches about innovation and disruption. He had built his fortune by acquiring promising smaller companies, integrating their technology into his empire, and transforming their founders into either loyal executives or cautionary tales about the dangers of overconfidence. When Harrison reached out to me through his investment team, expressing interest in a partnership that could accelerate StreamlineWorks' growth, I should have recognized the predatory gleam in his approach. Harrison was 53 years old, impeccably dressed, and possessed the kind of commanding presence that made people automatically defer to his opinions. During our first meeting at his downtown penthouse office, he spoke eloquently about the potential he saw in my technology and the synergies between StreamlineWorks and his existing portfolio of companies. He offered what seemed like a generous partnership structure that would allow me to maintain operational control while accessing his vast resources and distribution networks. What made Harrison's approach so insidious was how carefully he studied my previous experiences with betrayal and crafted his manipulation to exploit my specific vulnerabilities. He acknowledged the challenges I had faced as a young female entrepreneur and positioned himself as someone who recognized and respected my achievements. Harrison spoke about the importance of supporting innovative founders and claimed that his success came from empowering talented people rather than controlling them. The partnership agreement Harrison presented seemed designed to address every concern I had developed about protecting my intellectual property and maintaining creative control. His legal team had crafted documents that appeared to safeguard my interests while providing access to resources that could transform StreamlineWorks from a regional success story into a national powerhouse. Harrison talked about opening offices in major markets, hiring top talent, and scaling the platform to serve hundreds of thousands of businesses within 2 years. For several months, the partnership appeared to be everything Harrison had promised. StreamlineWorks gained access to enterprise clients that had been completely beyond our reach, and Harrison's marketing team helped us develop campaigns that dramatically increased our visibility in the business productivity market. I was invited to speak at major technology conferences and participate in panel discussions about entrepreneurship and innovation. For the first time since leaving home, I felt like I was being recognized as a legitimate player in my industry. That success made Harrison's eventual betrayal even more devastating because I had allowed myself to believe that maybe, finally, I had found someone who genuinely wanted to support my vision rather than steal it. Harrison's true plan revealed itself gradually, like a slow-acting poison that weakened my position before I realized what was happening. He began by systematically replacing key personnel at StreamlineWorks with his own people, claiming that we needed more experienced executives to handle our rapid growth. Harrison's most effective weapon was his ability to manipulate how others perceived me within my own company and industry. He spread subtle suggestions about my leadership style being too emotional and my decision-making being inconsistent, creating doubt about my competence without making direct accusations that could be challenged. His planted executives began questioning my strategic decisions in meetings, undermining my authority while positioning themselves as the reasonable voices of experience. The psychological warfare escalated when Harrison began sabotaging major client presentations by providing inside information to competitors or ensuring that technical difficulties would occur at crucial moments. He would then position himself as the steady hand who could clean up the messes that my inexperience had created, gradually convincing clients and investors that StreamlineWorks would be more stable under his direct leadership rather than in partnership with me. Harrison's campaign reached its climax during a presentation to a Fortune 500 company that could have been our biggest client acquisition ever. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Our software demonstration crashed repeatedly. Confidential pricing information somehow reached our competitors before the meeting. And key features that had worked perfectly during testing failed catastrophically in front of the client's executive team. The presentation was such a disaster that it made national technology news as an example of how young companies could be unprepared for enterprise-level partnerships. What I didn't discover until months later was that Harrison had orchestrated every aspect of that failure through a network of spies he had placed throughout my organization. His people had introduced subtle bugs into our demonstration software, leaked our pricing strategy to competitors, and even manipulated our internet connection to ensure maximum embarrassment during the presentation. Harrison's public response to the disaster was a masterclass in false sympathy, expressing concern about the pressures I was facing and suggesting that perhaps I needed more support to handle the complexities of scaling a technology business. The aftermath of that sabotaged presentation sent shockwaves through the technology industry, with investors and potential partners questioning whether StreamlineWorks was ready for the big leagues. Harrison positioned himself as the experienced mentor trying to help me learn from my mistakes, while secretly negotiating with my biggest clients to move their contracts to his other companies. I found myself fighting not just for my business, but for my professional survival, as Harrison's whisper campaign convinced more and more people that I was in over my head. The most painful part of Harrison's betrayal was recognizing how carefully he had studied my psychology and exploited my deepest insecurities. He knew that my previous experiences with Derek and Sophie had made me desperate to prove that I could build something lasting and successful, and he used that desperation to make me vulnerable to his manipulation. Harrison understood that my greatest fear was being dismissed as naive and incompetent, so he created situations that would make me appear exactly that way to the people whose opinions mattered most. Years 5 and 6 brought the darkest period of my entire journey, when Harrison's campaign of destruction reached its devastating conclusion, and I simultaneously discovered that my family's rejection was even more absolute than I had imagined. Harrison's final move came in the form of a hostile takeover attempt backed by financial documents that had been carefully manipulated to make StreamlineWorks appear far less profitable and stable than it actually was. His accounting team had been subtly adjusting our reported numbers for months, creating a paper trail that suggested I had been mismanaging company finances and inflating our success to attract investments I couldn't justify. The takeover bid was announced during the same week that I lost 3 of our biggest clients, all of whom cited concerns about StreamlineWorks' operational stability and leadership inconsistencies in their departure letters. These were clients who had been completely satisfied with our service just months earlier, but Harrison's people had been working behind the scenes to plant seeds of doubt about our long-term viability. The financial press picked up the story of the acquisition attempt and framed it as a rescue mission, with Harrison positioned as the experienced executive trying to save a failing company from its inexperienced founder. Former employees who had seemed loyal and supportive began defecting to Harrison's other companies, taking with them intimate knowledge of our systems and strategies. Some of these departures were clearly motivated by better compensation packages, but others felt like personal betrayals from people I had trusted and mentored. Harrison had offered several of my key developers positions that came with significant salary increases and equity stakes, making it nearly impossible for me to compete for their loyalty with my increasingly constrained resources. The legal battle against Harrison's takeover attempt consumed every dollar I had managed to save and forced me to mortgage every asset I owned. His team of corporate lawyers was relentless and well-funded, filing motion after motion that required expensive responses and dragged the proceedings out for months. They questioned every business decision I had made, demanded access to confidential strategic documents, and painted a picture of StreamlineWorks as a company that was successful despite my leadership rather than because of it. During this nightmare, I discovered that my family's rejection had been even more complete and permanent than I had ever imagined. My Aunt Carol, who had always been the most open-minded person in our extended family, had been secretly trying to build bridges between me and my parents for years. She had been sending them newspaper clippings about my business achievements, forwarding articles about women in technology, and gently suggesting that maybe it was time to reach out to their daughter, who was clearly making something of herself. Carol's attempts at reconciliation revealed the true depth of my parents' stubbornness and pride. When she showed my mother an article about StreamlineWorks being named one of the fastest-growing companies in our region, my mother's response was to ask Carol never to mention my name in their house again. My father's reaction was even more crushing. He told Carol that they had made their decision years ago and that people who abandon their families for selfish dreams don't deserve second chances. The most devastating revelation came when Carol told me about a conversation she had overheard between my parents at a family gathering. Someone had asked about me, not knowing about the estrangement, and my mother had responded by saying that they didn't have a daughter named Miranda, that their only child had died in a car accident years ago. The lie was so complete and convincing that several family members had actually sent sympathy cards, and my parents had apparently found it easier to maintain the fiction of my death than to admit they had been wrong about my potential. Learning about this conversation while simultaneously watching Harrison destroy everything I had built created a psychological breaking point that I had never experienced before. I found myself sitting in my apartment at 2 a.m, staring at my laptop screen and wondering if maybe everyone had been right about me all along. Maybe I was naive. Maybe I was in over my head. Maybe I should have listened to my parents and pursued something stable and predictable instead of chasing impossible dreams. The combination of professional destruction and family rejection triggered a complete emotional breakdown that lasted for several weeks. I stopped answering phone calls from clients, stopped responding to legal communications, and essentially became a hermit who survived on takeout food and whatever alcohol I could afford. Harrison's people reached out during this period with settlement offers that would have allowed me to retain a small percentage of Streamline Works while ceding all operational control to his organization. I came dangerously close to accepting one of these settlement offers, not because it was fair or reasonable, but because I was exhausted from fighting battles on multiple fronts with limited resources and no emotional support system. The idea of walking away from everything and starting over with a different career began to seem appealing compared to continuing a war I couldn't afford to win. Harrison's psychological campaign had been so effective that I was beginning to believe his narrative about my incompetence and inexperience. The final blow came when I was forced to sell Streamline Works at a massive loss in order to pay the legal fees that had accumulated during the takeover battle. Harrison's bid was ultimately unsuccessful, but the process had damaged the company's reputation and drained my resources so thoroughly that I had no choice but to accept an acquisition offer from a smaller competitor. The sale price barely covered my debts and left me with almost nothing to show for years of work and sacrifice. Harrison's public response to my defeat was a masterclass in false sympathy and manufactured concern. He gave interviews to industry publications expressing regret that such a promising young entrepreneur had been overwhelmed by the complexities of scaling a business too quickly. His comments were carefully crafted to appear supportive while reinforcing the narrative that I had failed due to inexperience and poor judgment rather than his systematic sabotage. The aftermath of this complete destruction left me facing a familiar but somehow more terrifying prospect. Starting over with nothing, but this time with a reputation that had been tarnished by Harrison's campaign and a level of cynicism that made it difficult to trust anyone's motives. I was 24 years old, completely alone, and beginning to wonder if my parents' assessment of my character and potential had been accurate all along. Years 6 and 7 became my preparation for the most calculated comeback in my life. A period when I made the strategic decision to completely disappear from the public eye while secretly building something that would be impossible for anyone to steal or sabotage. After the devastation of losing Streamline Works, I realized that all my previous attempts at building a business had failed because I had been too trusting, too visible, and too vulnerable to the predatory tactics of people like Derek, Sophie, and Harrison. My first decision was to vanish from the technology industry entirely for 6 months, letting people assume that I had given up and moved on to something else. I took a job as a night shift security guard at an office complex, which gave me access to empty offices with high-speed internet connections and 8 hours of uninterrupted time to work on my secret project. During the day, I slept in a tiny efficiency apartment that cost me $300 a month, and I spent my modest security guard salary on advanced programming courses and artificial intelligence research materials. The technology one was developing during those hidden months was unlike anything I had built before. A revolutionary AI-powered business analytics platform that could predict market trends and optimize business strategies with unprecedented accuracy. I called it PredictiveEdge, and it represented everything I had learned about business intelligence combined with cutting-edge machine learning algorithms that most companies wouldn't even attempt to implement for several more years. What made PredictiveEdge special wasn't just its technical capabilities, but the way I was building it to be completely protected from the kind of theft and sabotage I had experienced before. I was developing multiple layers of security, decentralized code repositories, and legal structures that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to claim ownership of my work or manipulate my business relationships. Every lesson I had learned from previous betrayals was being built into the foundation of this new company. During this period of secret development, I met David Huang and Alexis Carter, two exceptionally talented developers who became the first people I had trusted completely since my original betrayal by Derek. David was a former Google engineer who had left the corporate world to freelance because he was tired of building products that prioritized profit over innovation. Alexis was a brilliant programmer who specialized in artificial intelligence applications and had been blacklisted by several major tech companies for refusing to work on projects she considered ethically questionable. Both David and Alexis had their own stories of being exploited and betrayed by larger organizations, which created a bond between us that went beyond professional collaboration. We spent months working together in coffee shops and shared workspace environments, building PredictiveEdge piece by piece while maintaining complete secrecy about our ultimate goals. They understood my paranoia about security and intellectual property protection because they had experienced similar violations of trust in their own careers. The artificial intelligence algorithms we were developing could analyze vast amounts of business data and identify patterns that human analysts would never notice. PredictiveEdge could predict seasonal fluctuations, identify potential supply chain disruptions, and recommend strategic pivots that could increase profitability by significant percentages. We were essentially building a crystal ball for business decision-making, using technologies that were still considered experimental by most of the industry. More importantly, we were creating legal and technical safeguards that would make PredictiveEdge impossible to steal or replicate. Every component of the system was protected by multiple layers of encryption and authentication, with code repositories distributed across secure servers in different countries. We established multiple business entities with complex ownership structures that would make any attempted takeover prohibitively expensive and legally complicated. Our testing process involved working secretly with select small businesses whose owners were willing to implement our recommendations without knowing the full extent of the technology behind them. The results were extraordinary. Businesses that followed PredictiveEdge suggestions were seeing revenue increases of 30 to 50% within just a few months. We had created something that could genuinely transform how small businesses operated, and we were doing it with the kind of discretion and security that my previous ventures had completely lacked. During this development period, I was also building a comprehensive dossier of evidence about Harrison Blackwell's history of unethical business practices. I spent hundreds of hours researching his previous acquisitions, interviewing former employees who had been victimized by his tactics, and documenting patterns of manipulation and sabotage that extended far beyond what he had done to me. I was preparing for a war, but this time I would be the one with superior intelligence and strategic advantage. The psychological transformation I underwent during this period was as important as the technological development. I was learning to think like a predator rather than prey, to anticipate betrayal and manipulation before it could damage me. Every business relationship I considered was evaluated through multiple scenarios of potential betrayal, and every strategic decision was made with backup plans and exit strategies already in place. By the end of year 7, PredictiveEdge was ready for launch, but more importantly, I was ready to re-enter the business world as someone completely different from the naive young woman who had been repeatedly victimized by more experienced manipulators. I had become someone who understood power dynamics, who could play the game of corporate politics without sacrificing my integrity, and who had built something so technically sophisticated and legally protected that it would be nearly impossible for anyone to take away from me. The platform we had created was more than just a business tool. It was a weapon designed to give small businesses the same kind of strategic advantages that had previously been available only to major corporations with massive research and development budgets. We were about to level the playing field in a way that would disrupt entire industries, and we were doing it with the kind of preparation and protection that would make us untouchable. Year 7 and 8 marked my transformation from victim to victor, as PredictiveEdge launched publicly and began systematically dismantling Harrison Blackwell's empire, while establishing me as a force to be reckoned with in the technology industry. Our public launch strategy was carefully orchestrated to maximize impact while minimizing the opportunity for sabotage, with simultaneous announcements across multiple technology publications and demonstrations at 3 major industry conferences. The response to PredictiveEdge exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Within the first week of launch, we had received over 2,000 inquiries from businesses wanting to implement our platform, and technology analysts were calling it the most significant advancement in business analytics since the development of modern databases. The artificial intelligence algorithms David, Alexis, and I had developed were producing results that seemed almost magical to business owners who had never had access to sophisticated predictive modeling. Our media strategy was designed to position me as a comeback story, while subtly highlighting the obstacles I had overcome to reach this point. I gave interviews that focused on innovation and resilience without explicitly naming the people who had betrayed me, allowing reporters and industry observers to draw their own connections. The narrative that emerged portrayed me as a brilliant entrepreneur who had learned from early setbacks to build something truly revolutionary. The impact on Harrison's business empire was immediate and devastating. Major clients who had been working with his companies for years began requesting demonstrations of PredictiveEdge, and many of them discovered that our platform could deliver superior results at significantly lower costs. Harrison's business model had always depended on maintaining technological superiority over smaller competitors, but PredictiveEdge gave those competitors access to tools that were more advanced than anything in his portfolio. Within 6 months of our launch, Harrison lost contracts worth over $50 million to businesses that had switched to PredictiveEdge. His attempts to discredit our platform backfired spectacularly when independent analysts confirmed that our artificial intelligence algorithms were producing measurably better results than anything else available in the market. Harrison found himself in the unfamiliar position of competing against superior technology rather than simply using his resources to crush smaller rivals. My allies David and Alexis proved invaluable during this period, not just as technical partners, but as strategic advisors who helped me anticipate and counter Harrison's inevitable retaliation attempts. We had prepared for every possible form of attack, from corporate espionage to legal challenges to public relations campaigns designed to undermine our credibility. When Harrison's people tried to hack our systems, they discovered security measures that made their efforts not only futile, but easily traceable back to their sources. The most satisfying aspect of our success was watching Harrison's reputation crumble as more information about his unethical practices became public knowledge. The evidence I had compiled during my secret development period began appearing in investigative journalism pieces that exposed patterns of manipulation and predatory behavior spanning his entire career. Former employees who had been afraid to speak out began coming forward with their own stories of exploitation and betrayal. Harrison's legal troubles escalated when federal investigators launched an inquiry into his business practices, focusing specifically on securities fraud and violations of antitrust regulations. The investigation had been triggered by whistleblower reports from former employees whose testimonies corroborated the evidence I had carefully gathered and strategically leaked to appropriate authorities. Harrison discovered that his victims had been building a case against him for years, and that his downfall had been orchestrated by people he had underestimated. PredictiveEdge's valuation reached $50 million within 18 months of launch, making it one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the industry. We had achieved this growth while maintaining complete control over our intellectual property and business operations, proving that it was possible to scale rapidly without sacrificing independence to predatory investors. Our success became a case study in how innovative companies could protect themselves while competing against established players with vastly superior resources. My speaking engagements at technology conferences evolved from discussions of specific technical innovations to broader conversations about resilience, strategic planning, and the importance of building businesses that could withstand attempts at manipulation and sabotage. I became a sought-after advisor for other entrepreneurs who were facing similar challenges from larger competitors, sharing strategies for protecting intellectual property and maintaining independence during periods of rapid growth. The network of allies I built during this period included some of the most respected figures in the technology industry, people who appreciated both the quality of our innovations and the integrity of our business practices. These relationships provided protection against future attempts at corporate predation while opening doors to opportunities that had been completely beyond my reach during earlier phases of my career. Harrison's final attempts to damage PredictiveEdge involved spreading rumors about my mental stability and personal character, but these attacks only served to highlight his desperation and vindictive nature. The technology community had watched our success story unfold and understood that Harrison's criticism was motivated by professional jealousy rather than legitimate concerns. His reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed by this point that his opinions carried no weight with investors, clients, or industry analysts. By the end of year 8, PredictiveEdge had established itself as the dominant platform in its market segment, with a client base that included several Fortune 500 companies and a technological advantage that would be extremely difficult for competitors to replicate. We had built something that was not only successful but sustainable, protected by multiple layers of legal and technical safeguards that reflected everything I had learned about surviving in a predatory business environment. The personal satisfaction of watching Harrison's empire crumble while building something genuinely innovative and valuable was extraordinary. But the real victory was proving to myself that I could compete and win against people who had vastly superior resources and experience. I had transformed from a naive young woman who trusted too easily into a strategic thinker who could anticipate and counter sophisticated attacks while maintaining my ethical standards and creative vision. The month of the Forbes feature represented the culmination of everything I had worked toward since leaving home 8 years earlier, but it also triggered a series of family revelations that would force me to confront the deepest wounds from my past. The Forbes 30 Under 30 nomination process had been extensive and rigorous, involving multiple interviews, financial audits, and background checks that confirmed PredictiveEdge's $100 million valuation and my role in building it from nothing. During the Forbes interview process, I made a carefully considered decision about how much of my personal story to share publicly. The journalist assigned to my profile was fascinated by my journey from homeless teenager to successful entrepreneur, but I chose to focus primarily on the professional aspects of my success rather than the emotional devastation of being disowned by my family. I mentioned that I had been estranged from my parents since leaving home to pursue entrepreneurship, but I didn't elaborate on the cruel things they had said or the complete rejection I had experienced. The magazine feature that resulted from those interviews was everything I could have hoped for professionally. Forbes highlighted PredictiveEdge technological innovations, our rapid growth trajectory, and my vision for democratizing access to sophisticated business analytics tools. The article positioned me as an example of how determination and innovation could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and it included quotes from industry leaders who praised both my technical abilities and my business acumen. The national media attention that followed the Forbes publication was overwhelming and exhilarating. I received interview requests from major television networks, speaking invitations from prestigious conferences, and partnership proposals from investors who had previously been completely beyond my reach. PredictiveEdge's client base exploded as businesses across the country wanted to work with the company that had been featured so prominently in one of the most respected business publications in the world. What I didn't anticipate was how the Forbes feature would ripple through my extended family and force confrontations that had been years in the making. My cousin Tyler, who had been 12 years old when I left home, was now 20 and working as a marketing coordinator for a regional advertising agency. He saw the Forbes article when it was shared on social media and immediately recognized my name and photograph, despite how much I had changed since he last saw me. Tyler's reaction to discovering my success was a mixture of pride and outrage that reflected how conflicted our family had become about my estrangement. He had grown up hearing contradictory stories about what had happened to me. Sometimes my parents claimed I had died in an accident. Other times they said I had moved away and lost touch. And occasionally, they would let slip references to arguments and disappointment that suggested a more complicated truth. Tyler's decision to reach out to me through LinkedIn opened a floodgate of information about how my family had been processing my absence and success over the years. He revealed that my parents had been secretly following my career online for at least 3 years, reading every article about my companies and tracking my professional achievements, while maintaining their public position that they had no daughter named Miranda. The internal family dynamics that Tyler described were both heartbreaking and infuriating. My mother, Janet, had apparently been struggling with guilt and regret for years, particularly after learning about my early struggles and the betrayals I had experienced from business partners. She had wanted to reach out multiple times, but had been prevented by my father Robert's stubborn pride and his refusal to admit that they had been wrong about my potential. According to Tyler, the arguments between my parents about contacting me had become increasingly frequent and bitter as my success became more undeniable. My mother would show my father articles about my companies and suggest that maybe it was time to bridge the gap, but he would respond by becoming angry and defensive about their original decision. He had apparently convinced himself that my success was either temporary or undeserved, and that reaching out would only encourage me to think I had been right to abandon my family. The most painful revelation was learning about how my success had affected my mother's mental health and self-perception. Tyler told me that Janet had been attending therapy for depression and anxiety related to losing contact with me, and that she had admitted to him that seeing my name in Forbes had triggered both pride and overwhelming grief about the relationship we might have had. The extended family politics surrounding my estrangement were complex and emotionally charged, with different relatives taking different positions about whether my parents should attempt reconciliation or maintain their dignity by sticking to their original decision. Some family members had apparently been advocating for reaching out to me for years, while others supported my parents' position that I had made my choice and needed to live with the consequences. Tyler's most significant revelation was about the conversation that had finally pushed my mother to send that text message. The morning the Forbes article was published, Janet had called Tyler in tears after reading the profile and realizing the full extent of what I had accomplished. She had spent the entire day arguing with my father about whether to contact me, with their discussion escalating into the kind of screaming match that their neighbors could hear through the walls. According to Tyler, my mother's decision to send that text message was an act of rebellion against my father's continued stubbornness. Robert had apparently forbidden her from contacting me, claiming that doing so would be an admission of failure and weakness that would undermine their authority as parents. Janet's text message represented her choice to prioritize her relationship with me over her marriage dynamics, a decision that had created significant tension in their household. The family drama that erupted after my mother sent that message was apparently intense and ongoing. My father was furious about Janet's decision to reach out without his approval, while my mother was determined to rebuild our relationship regardless of his objections. Tyler described their household as being in a state of constant conflict, with both parents trying to recruit him and other family members to support their respective positions. Learning about these family dynamics while managing the professional opportunities created by the Forbes feature was emotionally exhausting and psychologically complex. Part of me felt vindicated by the evidence that my success had forced my parents to confront their mistakes, but another part of me was heartbroken by the realization that they had been watching my struggles and achievements from afar without offering support when I had desperately needed it. The coffee shop meeting with my mother 3 weeks after her unexpected text message was one of the most emotionally complex conversations of my adult life, representing both the potential for healing and the necessity of establishing boundaries that would protect the person I had become. I chose a neutral location equidistant from both our homes, arriving early to mentally prepare for seeing the woman who had declared me dead to her family 8 years earlier. Janet looked older than I had expected, with gray streaks in her hair and worry lines that suggested the years of estrangement had taken their toll on her as well. When she saw me walk into the coffee shop, her immediate reaction was tears followed by an attempt to hug me that I politely but firmly deflected. We sat across from each other at a small table, and for several minutes neither of us seemed to know how to begin a conversation that carried so much history and pain. My mother's apology was heartfelt but incomplete, focusing primarily on her regret about losing contact with me rather than acknowledging the cruelty of her original rejection. She told me how proud she was of my achievements and how difficult it had been to watch my success from a distance, but she struggled to take responsibility for the specific things she had said during our final confrontation. Janet seemed to want reconciliation without fully reckoning with the damage her words and actions had caused. I listened to her explanation about my father's continued resistance to reaching out and her decision to contact me despite his objections, but I found myself feeling more sadness than anger about their family dynamics. The woman sitting across from me seemed smaller and more fragile than the mother I remembered, and her attempts to explain 8 years of silence revealed how trapped she had become in a position that probably stopped making sense to her years ago. My response to her overture was carefully measured and focused on establishing realistic expectations for any potential relationship going forward. I told her that while I appreciated her willingness to reach out, I wasn't interested in pretending that 8 years of rejection hadn't fundamentally changed who I was and how I approached family relationships. I had built a life and career without any support from my parents, and I wasn't going to sacrifice my emotional well-being for the sake of restoring their comfort. The conversation that followed was honest in ways that our family had never experienced before my departure. I shared specific examples of how their rejection had affected my early struggles and how their absence had forced me to develop resilience and independence that might never have emerged if I had retained their support. Janet listened with obvious distress as I described sleeping in my car and surviving on minimum wage jobs while building my first companies. My mother's revelation about my father's ongoing stubbornness was both expected and disappointing. Robert had apparently maintained his position that reaching out to me would validate my decision to leave home and undermine his authority as a parent. He was still telling people that I had abandoned my family for selfish reasons and that my success didn't change the fact that I had been disrespectful and ungrateful as a teenager. When Janet asked if I would be willing to meet with both my parents together, I declined and explained that I wasn't interested in subjecting myself to Robert's continued hostility and defensiveness. I told her that any relationship we built would need to be separate from her marriage dynamics and that I wouldn't be participating in family gatherings or events where my presence might create conflict with other relatives who had supported their decision to disown me. The boundaries I established during that conversation were non-negotiable and designed to protect the emotional stability I had worked so hard to achieve. I told Janet that I was open to occasional contact, but that I wouldn't be providing updates about my personal life or seeking their approval for my decisions. Our relationship would need to be rebuilt from scratch based on mutual respect rather than traditional family obligations. Over the following months, my mother and I developed a cautious but genuine connection that respected the boundaries I had established while allowing for gradual healing of old wounds. She began attending therapy to address her own guilt and regret about the estrangement, and she eventually convinced my father to participate in family counseling sessions focused on understanding the impact of their decisions. Robert's eventual apology came 6 months after my mother's initial outreach and was clearly the result of extensive therapeutic intervention rather than spontaneous recognition of his mistakes. His acknowledgement of being wrong about my potential was grudging and incomplete, but it represented progress from his previous position that I had been foolish and ungrateful. We developed a distant but civil relationship that satisfied my mother while respecting my need for emotional protection. The reconciliation process taught me that forgiveness didn't require forgetting or pretending that damage hadn't been done, but that healing was possible when people were willing to acknowledge mistakes and respect new boundaries. My success hadn't been motivated by a desire to prove my parents wrong, but having them finally recognize my achievements provided a sense of closure that allowed me to move forward without carrying their rejection as an open wound. My decision to use my wealth and influence to mentor other young entrepreneurs became a central focus of my philanthropic efforts, particularly supporting people who had been rejected by their families or betrayed by business partners. I established a foundation that provided both funding and mentorship for entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds, creating the kind of support system I had wished for during my own struggles. The speaking engagement I accepted at my former community college's graduation ceremony became an opportunity to share my story with young people who might be facing similar choices between family expectations and personal ambitions. I spoke about the importance of pursuing your vision even when others don't understand it, but also about the costs of that choice and the resilience required to succeed without traditional support systems. My reflection on the entire journey from rejection to reconciliation revealed how being betrayed and abandoned had ultimately made me stronger, more independent, and more capable of building genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or convenience. The family that had rejected me had eventually been forced to acknowledge my worth, but by that point, I had learned to value myself independently of their approval. The final lesson of my story is that sometimes the people who reject you will eventually recognize your value, but the most important recognition comes from proving to yourself that you can succeed and thrive regardless of their support or opposition. Success isn't about changing other people's minds about your worth. It's about becoming the person you always had the potential to be, even when nobody else could see that potential. Sometimes the family that rejects you becomes the family that finally sees you, but by then, you've learned the most valuable lesson of all: how to see yourself clearly and love the person you've become through your own strength and determination. What's your relationship like with your family? Have you ever had to choose between pursuing your dreams and maintaining family relationships? Let me know in the comments below, because I'd love to hear your stories of resilience and success. If this video resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about overcoming obstacles and building success on your own terms. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that their dreams are valid even when their family doesn't understand them. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your potential isn't determined by other people's limitations or fears. Keep pursuing your vision, keep building your dreams, and never let anyone convince you that you're not capable of extraordinary things.